Clams, the Aga Khan, limos, what do these all have in common? They're among the items that have wound up under the Ethics Commissioner's scrutiny over the past 3 years. This week, Canada's ethics watchdog launched an investigation into the SNC-Lavalin affair, the fifth ethics probe involving the Trudeau cabinet. First under the microscope, Jane Philpott. In 2016, it came to light that she spent $3,700 on a Toronto area limo service. That limo company is owned by a Liberal supporter who volunteered on her campaign.
I've taken responsibility, I apologize for that, and we will put steps in place to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Philpott was cleared of any ethics breach, but she still refunded taxpayers. Perhaps the most high-profile investigation came next into Justin Trudeau's family vacation on an island in the Bahamas owned by the Aga Khan. The trip cost taxpayers $127,000. The Aga Khan was a friend of Pierre Trudeau, but he also actively lobbies for government funding. The ethics watchdog ruled the trip was a violation of multiple ethics rules, making Justin Trudeau the first Prime Minister to break Canada's federal ethics laws.
I take full responsibility for this. This was a family vacation that I am responsible for, and I take responsibility.
Next, Finance Minister Bill Morneau and a possible ethics conflict with Bill C-27. Morneau tabled the bill in 2016. It makes changes to how private companies can set up pensions for their employees. The opposition cried conflict of interest, saying the bill would benefit Morneau's family firm, Morneau-Chappell, a pension management company, in which Morneau still owned about 1 million shares. Morneau's response to the criticism?
I've decided not only to sell all of my and my family's assets to the company I built with my father for 25 years, I've also decided to donate any difference in value in those shares from the time I was elected until now.
Ultimately, the Ethics Commissioner investigated and found no wrongdoing. The fourth case centered around Dominic LeBlanc and a lucrative Arctic surf clam license. LeBlanc issued the license to the Five Nations Clam Company in 2018, but connected to that company is LeBlanc's wife's cousin. The Ethics Commissioner ruled LeBlanc in violation of ethics rules, saying he should have recused himself from the contract decision.
I obviously didn't think that this was caught by the definition of relative or family in the Act. The Commissioner, however, has the responsibility to make those determinations. I accept his determination.
Which brings us to February 2019. The Ethics Commissioner is now looking into whether someone in the Prime Minister's office pressured Jody Wilson-Raybould to intervene in a criminal case against SNC-Lavalin.
We welcome the Ethics Commissioner's investigation. I think it's extremely important that Canadians can continue to have confidence in our system.
Let's bring in the power panel with Merelda Fiddler, Robin Urbach, Marty Patriquin, and Stephen Chase. Marty, I wanted to start with you because we're, of course, talking about the latest in that five different investigations, the one involving Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Prime Minister's office, and SNC-Lavalin. We had the mayor of Sarnia on a little earlier on the show, and he was very concerned that the potential job loss and effects that a negative consequence on SNC-Lavalin might have were kind of being lost in the conversation. You're in Quebec. I'm wondering if you can give us sort of a feeling as to the flavor there and how this story is playing out there.
Yeah, there's a realization here, like there would be anywhere, that SNC-Lavalin has, in the order, I believe it's around 9,400 employees, a large number of them here in Quebec, that the company is too big to fail. If it was to fail, it would be catastrophic to the Quebec economy. And it's arguably one of the reasons that these deferred prosecution agreements were set up in the first place. That said, SNC has been dragged through the mud for a long time. We had the situation, of course, with Libya, the charges that came out in 2015. We have their bid rigging with the MUHC hospital here in Montreal, which one police officer called, and I'm paraphrasing here, the biggest scandal corruption-wise in Canada's history. There was never any screaming before all this stuff came out with Trudeau in the last few weeks. There's never any screaming that said that SNC-Lavalin should face preferential treatment simply because of the fact of this. This stuff is being foisted on us by the by what's come out in the Globe and Mail. The idea that a government would interfere in what a prosecutor should or shouldn't do with a private company, or a publicly traded company, but a non-governmental company. It almost creates almost like a rebound effect, in the sense that there's a pushback from Quebecers saying that that these old tropes that Quebec is sort of getting favorable treatment and all that kinds of stuff, and then everybody else from outside the country sort of says, well, look, Quebec's getting it because it's Quebec. That's how the economic question of what happens to SNC ventures into the political, and it's quite a familiar story here in Quebec.
Meralda, we heard the Prime Minister talk more about this today, and sort of like other themes, we hear more and more on this theme every time the Prime Minister answers questions. And today he was pretty clear about there being jobs being a priority, but also hearing from Premier Legault, Premier Couillard before him, other MPs, he said, and the company himself, which we already know. Is that a sort of an argument that could have some impact?
I don't know if it really can. We'll have to kind of wait and see how people start to view this. But when you look at the cumulative effects of having all of these ethics probes, and people see a very large company, they don't see the people underneath, which I think is a mistake, because we really need to think about that. But they see a very, very large company getting preferential treatment from friends. And that is a really, really hard kind of image to kind of strip off and say, but wait, there's almost 5,000 people and their jobs at stake here. So it won't really matter, I don't think, which other leaders you have come out and speak about that. When we were listening to the mayor, I mean, I feel that when you have big companies shut down in small locations, those kinds of impacts are massive. And I think we can't overlook those people, but at the same time, it's hard to see past executives who make bad decisions.
Robin, do you think I mean, the discussion here is so political. Is there any way at this point to separate the two?
I don't think so. I mean, because of that connection and that alleged connection, I should say, that has been made now, I don't know that you really can separate the two. And that's the whole point, that this should have been a completely separate case, that there shouldn't have been any sort of overlap between politics and the judicial system in this case that was handling what was going on and these criminal charges. The fact that there is that overlap now is something that we can't sort of turn the clock back on and hopefully everybody forgets. I think it's unavoidably interlinked right now, and I don't really see a way that we can separate the two.
Should Canadians, Stephen, be reassured by the fact that even if this pitch was going on, this alleged pressure happened, the potential for interference happened, the director of the Public Prosecution Service decided in the end not to award a DPA or not to proceed with a DPA. I know that decision is being appealed, but it would appear, at least in, not to say that that diminishes the controversy at all, but at least there is some independence of the judicial system.
There was independence, and actually in the legislation that creates these deferred prosecution agreements, it says you're not allowed to consider the national economic interest.
Yeah.
You're supposed to make it without that.
Which is different than other countries which have DPAs, which do factor in the economic impact.
Now, of course, as you said, SNC-Lavalin is appealing this, and it'll be up to the courts to decide what to do. But I bet you if they succeed, it'll actually be thrown back to Cabinet, not, because they're actually asking for the courts not only to quash this decision, but then direct a beginning of negotiations on a deferred prosecution agreement. And I bet if they do succeed in the first instance, it's going to be thrown back to the government.
Do you think that they'll be successful? I mean, I guess it would be an independent evaluation. It wouldn't factor in all of this, but how can...
I can't tell.
My God.
I can't tell. No.
Yeah.
Just to pick up a little bit on that, I was speaking to a lawyer this week about this. The other thing, too, is the sort of unspoken thing about all of this is that if SNC-Lavalin does face these charges and is ultimately found guilty, they are in a lot of trouble. In part because their reputation is so tattered outside of Canada already because of the World Bank ban in 2013. In 2013, the World Bank put a 10-year ban on SNC bidding on any contracts around the world, and that was related to the Libya stuff. Their market is already made much smaller, and if their reputation in their home base becomes so tattered that they're going to be in a lot of trouble.
What do you guys think, Merelda, about, off the top of this block, we played the sort of different ethics investigations that have been conducted into the Prime Minister's cabinet. Not all of them have been founded. We certainly don't know the outcome of this one. Is there, though, a problem come election time when you have that kind of narrative out there for I guess, for the opposition's choosing, from whoever is campaigning against the government?
Well, one of the things that, was said earlier is they really did campaign on very specific things about looking out for the little person, about not being, privileged and only looking out for rich and only looking out for corporations and executives. And when you have those kinds of ethics concerns, it actually puts that right back into them, saying, no, actually you are very connected and you are trying to protect your friends and you are making money off of this. And I think that's something that you can't really get away from, especially when you have 5 of these instances, whether they're proven or not, in such a short period of time. That just gives people the impression of a pattern, whether there's a pattern or not.
Robin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think what's particularly damning about this collection is that, it's not so much that it's unprecedented to hear of these sorts of scandals or that it breaks new ground or that it's totally unfamiliar. I think what's damning about it is that it is actually very familiar, right down to the fact that we have a federal Liberal government that is allegedly sowing favors for a Quebec company. And all of this talk about ethics and conflict of interest, I'm remembering a golf course in Quebec and all of those other things. So I think it's bringing back those memories. And as some of the others have said, for a government that campaigned on the whole idea that it was going to be different, that there is going to be real change, that this is going to be transparent and forthright and not like the same governments that you've seen before. This is really damaging to that reputation. So the collective really undermines what this whole government purported to be about at the onset of 2015.
Well, it's interesting, Stephen, too, because in the resignation letter that Jody Wilson-Raybould put out, the line that definitely stuck out to me was the one around doing politics differently, and that she had run for a federal seat under that mantra, that idea. And she doesn't say it never happened, but her resignation in a way kind of speaks to that.
Yeah, and if you'll remember during the Harper years, the Liberals were constantly preaching the virtue of not telling independent appointees how to do their job. Like, for instance, overriding what an ombudsman or an auditor general thinks. In fact, leaving it to the civil service to make proper decisions. In this case, we have a decision from the Director of Public Prosecutions, and they're going to be in a real bind if the decision comes back to them, because they're going to be forced to override her. That said, I think it takes a while for a narrative to build up about a party in government. I think it takes several years, and I'm not sure whether 3.5 years is enough to really build a narrative that people buy into. So
it is.
Marty, what do you think? Yeah.
The mitigating thing to that, I would argue, though, is that we're 8 months from an election. And if this story, Stephen can probably let us know in the coming weeks. But I'm sure there's more to this. There's certainly more questions to be answered, and we are getting closer to that election.